Hi there, this is Karen Magruder, and I'm an assistant professor in practice at the UTA School of Social Work. I think it's really important for students when they first are starting a class, not only to dive into the material and what they need to learn, but also to have a good foundation for learning strategies, ways of thinking critically, memorizing material, studying, time management, that kind of thing, and just ways to make material stick in their memory, because especially in our foundation courses, these are really important concepts that you'll need to know for not only your career and personal and professional development, but also for licensing exams and integrative seminars and things like that. And so I hope that this video provides some good tips on not so much content, but how to best access and memorize and engage with the content you're learning in your courses. So first of all, critical thinking is, of course, very, very important. We talk about it in many of our courses, but it's really important to not just regurgitate facts and information, but to analyze and think critically about what you're learning, to, question things and make sure things are research-based and evidence-based, and I encourage you to take a click at this YouTube link that I've provided here for kind of a funny example of the importance of thinking critically. Another concept is mental models and schemas. A lot of us come into social work education with existing biases or mental models, which is sort of a way of thinking about the world and organizing information in the world. That doesn't necessarily mean that, you're a racist or a sexist or anything like that. It's just that everybody has different backgrounds and ways of seeing the world, and I want everyone to be aware and self-reflective and self-examining about those mental models. And so one quote that I really appreciate is that the map is not the territory. And what that basically means is that our mental models of say race or gender or education or anything like that is kind of this construct that we've thought about from all the different experiences we've had, everything we've read and whatnot, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the way that we view things is exactly perfectly aligned to the way everybody else views things and reality. So we sometimes have a little bit of tinted glasses or things like that. So in my in-person classes, I do this question, where are you right now? And my students will be a little confused and they'll say, I'm at UTA, I'm in a classroom. And I'll say, well, how do you know that you're in a classroom? And they'll say, well, I saw I parked at the school and I walked in, I, knew this was a school building. And so, okay, imagine you were kidnapped and had a bag over your head, and they brought you into this room and they took the bag off your head, so you didn't know how you got here. Would you still know you were in a classroom? They say, yeah. So, well, how do you know? Well, there's a whiteboard and a computer and desks, and it looks like a classroom. And so in doing that, I force students to be able to explain what their mental model or schema is of a classroom, right? To them, a classroom is a place with, desks that are, often in rows and face the front and has a whiteboard and a projector and, things like that. So I might say, well, how do you know you're not in a train station or something like that? And they'll say, well, because a train station has, tracks and overhead paging noises and announcements, and you get the idea. So that's just a way of conceptualizing what a mental model is, because, if you went to another country, you probably would still be able to recognize a classroom, but it might look pretty different. Another example is my older brother. His first word when he was a baby was car. He loved cars, and as it would have it, he's now a mechanical engineer working for Honda. So what he used to do, though, when he was a kid, is anything with wheels. He would say car. So a car, a bus, a motorcycle, a bicycle, anything that moved and had wheels was a car, because that's what his mental model was of a car. But as he grew older and became more sophisticated in his reasoning, he was able to differentiate between a car versus, a bicycle or a motorcycle or a unicycle, etc. Another interesting example of mental models and schemas is the movie Midsummer. It's a horror movie, so I just want to let you know before you go and watch it. It's scary and a bit graphic. But one thing that's really, really interesting about Midsummer is that it's this, thriller horror movie that is set at a summer solstice festival. So if you look at these girls in the left photo, our mental model or our schema of a horror movie, at least for me, was, it's dark, maybe someone's in a secluded cabin in the woods, and it's nighttime, and creepy things start happening, or it's, apocalyptic, like something has happened where it's, the end of the world and there's zombies or something like that. In my kind of schema of what horror movies are, it was generally not this. A bunch of, beautiful girls and with flower wreaths and white dresses, celebrating something at, a summer festival. And so I think that's a really interesting example of a schema being kind of flipped on its head. And so all of that to say, here's one more example of, what is a Native American, right? Obviously, many people would be very offended by people having Halloween costumes that sort of caricature Native Americans. And so I share all of that in order to help you examine what your mental model is of, perhaps what an older adult is, or what a CPS worker is, or things like that, so that you can be aware, think critically, and challenge those mental models. When you're thinking critically, here are some key questions you should be asking. What do we being, I guess, society or the social work world, what do we know? How do we know it? Why do we accept this information as being true? What is the evidence for or against? What competing views are there? And what's the consequence of holding this belief? So as you're going through, different modules in this course, I encourage you to really go through these questions and think critically about the material that you're engaging with. I also think it's very important to be aware of logical fallacies, particularly if you're doing advocacy work, either at the micro or macro level. You want to be persuasive and logical in your arguments, and so I want students to avoid these logical fallacies. And these aren't all of them, but there's some common examples. An ad hominem, it literally means against the man, and that's where you're attacking the person specifically and not their position. So an example of this would be, Crooked Hillary. That's talking about her as her person being immoral or, crooked, rather than saying, well, she, her policy proposals are not sound because XYZ. A false dichotomy. This is you're either for me or against me. Basically having this black and white thinking and without those shades of gray. Another one is a slippery slope. You start with a very kind of benign premise and then move to the very extreme without necessarily having reasons for that. So a classic example a few years ago was, if you let gay people get married, the next thing you know, people will be marrying their pets. That's an example of a logical fallacy of a slippery slope. Is there evidence that, allowing equality in marriage is going to lead to, bestiality being legalized? I don't necessarily think that's true. Appealing to authority, so celebrity endorsements of products, right? Michael Jordan, excellent basketball player. He's a spokesman for Fruit of the Loom underwear. Really, if you think about it, is it logical that I should buy Fruit of the Loom underwear because Michael Jordan uses it? Well, not necessarily. Michael Jordan and I might have very different, underwear needs. But that's an example of appeal to authority. A hasty generalization is stereotyping or exaggerating without sufficient evidence. So everyone who drives a Prius is a liberal. A red herring is diverting attention from the real issue or problem. So that could be like distraction or changing the subject or things like that. So maybe a mom tells her kid to go to bed and he says that he is hungry. And causal fallacy. So this is really important to know for your research classes. Hopefully you are kind of have some familiarity with this already, but I think it's worth repeating that correlation does not imply causation. So a great example of that is that there's a strong positive correlation between ice cream sales and deaths by drowning. So you could say, well, it's all those ice cream sales, all those people eating ice cream, something about eating the ice cream just makes them want to go, drown in their pool. Or that eating ice cream somehow incapacitates people so that they drown in their pool. Well, that's not the case, right? Obviously, both are tied to heat, right? As it gets hotter, people are more likely to buy ice cream, and they're also more likely to go swimming and therefore drown. And another example that I use a lot of times with my students is the strong positive correlation between umbrella use and rain. And so therefore, when people use umbrellas, that causes it to rain. And there's evidence of this, right? It's, raining, you look out the window, a lot of people are using umbrellas. Obviously, all that umbrella use caused it to rain, right? Well, no, obviously it was the other way around, but just being mindful of this, that you're not implying a causation when none exists. And then finally, the bandwagon fallacy. If I say 80% of Arlington residents voted in favor of this resolution or whatever, saying, well, you should too, and that's not necessarily the case. Just because the majority feels one way doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right way to go. So goals and deep learning. I think it's incredibly important for students to make goals and connect what they're learning to their own goals. So maybe you are really focused on your career. You want to work with in a private practice therapy setting, for example, doing counseling. And so when you're learning things, always thinking about how will this help me one day in my counseling practice? Or it might be personal goals as well. Maybe you want to build connections and make friends at school. And so engaging in discussion boards or class conversations will help you to reach that goal. And that really helps to ingrain that learning. Because if you think in your head, oh, I'm just learning this to pass this test, or get an A on this quiz, or finish this paper, you're much more likely to forget that information. Whereas if you really intentionally think, okay, I'll need to know this for my licensing exam in the future, for my integrative seminar in the future, or for, my career, or helping my, crazy Aunt Sue, that's really going to help you learn that information. So some ways of doing goals are SMART goals. You've probably heard of this. Something that is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timed. And then also WHOOP. This came from a book. I'm blanking at the moment on what book this is from. It was like a self-improvement book. And it was talking about wish what you want to achieve, basically, the outcome, what's in the way or the obstacle, and what's your plan for overcoming that. So there's some tools you can use for goal setting. Time management is incredibly, incredibly important. It's something that I'm always trying to improve on, but I think I do pretty well. I've just generally been really busy, often have multiple jobs, and take on a lot. And certainly it's important to have self-care and have balance, but also I think a way that I'm generally able to get a lot done is through good time management skills and making sure I'm meeting deadlines and things like that. So one strategy is to never waste waiting time. If you're at the mechanic or at an airport or at the doctor's office and you're going to be sitting around waiting, not squandering that time. So I always try and make sure I have a book with me, or in your case maybe study material with you, so that you're never wasting time. You're always able to use that time productively. You can even install apps on your phone that maybe help you study for a a licensing exam or something like that. And so if you're like waiting in line at the grocery store, you can, go on your phone and be answering emails or learning something or looking at the news or things like that, even meditating. So another one, like I was just saying, is keeping notes with you. So it doesn't mean you have to bring an entire book. I had an experience where I was at a training, and there were certainly parts of the training that were useful, but there was also some things that were really stuff that I already knew, and I was trying to be, respectful and, actively listening. But what I also had with me in that same notebook where I was taking notes were these notes I was trying at the time to memorize the different attachment styles by Mary Ainsworth. And so I had basically a version of this written in my notebook. And so as there were times in the lecture that were not as helpful or relevant to me, I would kind of glance at these notes and just take a couple seconds to review some of this information, and then I would kind of switch back to studying. Now, that's not necessarily, the best thing to do, right? I know multitasking can sometimes be not beneficial for our learning, and certainly you want to be respectful of, presenters and things like that. But I just share that as an example that if you unexpectedly have some time, you don't necessarily have to have a whole book with you, but even if you just, in that same notebook, where you're taking notes, have something else that you'd like to study, you can flip back to that, while you're waiting for class to start or something like that. Another one is to listen to YouTube videos and podcasts. So I've included a few examples. Anything from Khan Academy, that's Khan, is usually really good. It's actually an MCAT preparation usually, but there's a lot of concepts that are relevant, in terms of psychology and human development and things like that that are really good for social workers to know. And also the Crash Course series, there's like 40 of these videos on a whole bunch of different psychology related topics. Again, extremely relevant for social work students. This is a video here of like just a funny, silly animated thing that goes through the stages of loss: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Yes, DABDA, that's the acronym, to kind of help you remember that. And so I will listen to, podcasts or, books on tape while I'm driving to make use of my commute, or while I'm walking my dogs, or even sometimes while I'm getting ready. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to be productive at all times. Sometimes I listen to a meditation video or some really relaxing music to help me, chill out. And so it doesn't always have to be, productive, but you can still kind of use time where you're doing other things like doing the dishes to be able to, listen to something that is helpful, even these lecture videos. So maybe you're doing yoga while you're listening to my video, or you're, knitting or whatever that is. And focusing. Certainly multitasking is something that we have to do at times, but studies show that it can be detrimental. And so I know I'm kind of contradicting myself, right? That if you're listening to something and doing something else, you're not 100% focusing. But I think it sort of depends on what you're studying, right? If it's just something that you want to have in the background, it's okay to be doing multiple things at once. But if it's material that's really difficult, or that you really want to make sure that you get the first time around, the best strategy in that case is to focus on it really single-mindedly and minimize distractions. You also want to take breaks, and so don't have, these marathon sessions. When I'm teaching in person, I try basically every 20 to 30 minutes to break up what I'm doing. If I'm, giving like a mini lecture or something, I try to not make it last too long so that folks have an opportunity to switch to, a discussion or an activity, or at least go to the restroom or things like that. That's important to refocus as well. And there's another excellent book called A Mind for Numbers, which is really geared towards people in the STEM, math and engineering, technology, that kind of thing. But is relevant really even for folks in more liberal arts disciplines. And it's by Barbara Oakley, and it talks about different strategies of learning. But one of the key takeaways I got from it is focus mode versus diffusing mode. And so there's some problems or tasks where you really need to give it your full attention. And then there's other tasks that it's kind of helpful if you take a break or walk away from it and come back to it with a fresh mind. So I included this funny picture here of this cat. If you're only focusing on the problem, you might miss the easy solution. This is an example where the cat should have been in diffuse mode rather than focus mode. So if you want to learn more about that, I would encourage you to explore that book. Okay, memory tactics. I love mnemonic devices and graphics. So when I was studying for my LCSW exam, one of the things that's really important to know is the order that you should take in terms of working with clients. There's a ton of questions that are like, what would you do first, or what would you do next? And so it's very important to recognize the steps of social work intervention, and that the first thing you do, is engaging, building rapport, validating their feelings, and only after you do that can you move on to assessing and goal setting and intervening, evaluating, and finally terminating. So a mnemonic device that I created for that is, for this engage, assess, plan, intervene, evaluate, terminate, is EAP, in every terminal. So EAP is an acronym I'm already familiar with. It stands for Employee Assistance Program. So I'm, in my mind, like EAP is a thing. So instead of Employee Assistance Program, I'm thinking Engagement, Assessment, Planning. And then IN for intervention, EV for every for evaluation, and terminal for termination. So I imagine like an airport terminal. And I imagine that in every airport terminal, there's an employee assistance program. And I never had to study this list again, because once I had that mnemonic device and that kind of conception in my mind, I was able to remember it easily. I also am big on smart art and graphics to help you to remember concepts. Maybe that's drawing or something like that, and I really encourage that. Here's another example. So when I was trying to learn different medications, there's a class of antidepressant medications called MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and they're used to treat depression. And so some examples of MAOIs are Nardil and Parnate. Most of the MAOIs have this R sound in them. And so I was trying to look at like what's in common with all of these, and all of the MAOIs I studied had an R sound in them. So that R reminds me of a pirate. And pirates, of course, sail the seas, and maybe pirates are sailing in Maui, which is similar to MAOI. So when I think MAOIs, I think Maui. What's around Maui? A pirate. R, Nardil, Parnate. And again, now it's not like I had to study this list over and over and over again. I just came up with that memory trick, and I'll remember that forever, and hopefully you will too. Similarly, for mood stabilizers, these are used to treat bipolar disorder. I think I'm just trying to give you examples, here of what works for me. Of course, if these work for you, awesome. If not, coming up with your own versions that are meaningful to you. But so here are some examples of medications that are used to treat bipolar disorder, which, if you don't know, is basically where someone, might alternate between depression and mania, where they're either, happy, have an elevated mood, or, are very active with racing thoughts or risky behaviors or things like that. So it's the very simplistic way of thinking about bipolar is like depressed versus manic, hot and cold, happy and sad, that kind of thing. I'm really simplifying it, but that helps you remember for bipolar. So Depakote, I think of, okay, a coat. So you wear a coat when it's cold outside. I think hot and cold, those are opposites. Depakote is for bipolar opposites. Similarly, Tegretol makes me think of a tiger, and tigers have two different colored stripes, right? Orange and black. And so two different colors, two different poles, bipolar. Tegretol is for bipolar. Topamax, I thought of a top hat. Top hats are always black. Black and white, happy and sad, bipolar. And then finally, Lamictal. This is a little bit more of a stretch, but for me, when I was thinking of Lamictal, it made me think of like licking, limic, lick. licking an ice cream cone that is cold, hot and cold, bipolar. So again, just some examples of that. Oh, and then what I did to remember all of these things is I combined them, right? I have the coat, the tiger, the top hat, and the ice cream cone, and I would try and combine them into a single picture of some dude wearing, you know, a tiger striped fur coat with a top hat, you know, having an ice cream cone, and that helped me to remember these 4 medications: Depakote, Tegretol, Topamax, and Lamictal. Got just a couple more examples. In psychoanalytic theory, they talk about ego dystonic versus ego syntonic. So looking at the root word, right? Dystonic, dys is kind of not, right? So if you're dysfunctional, you're going to feel guilty. So basically something that's ego dystonic means that you recognize that it's wrong or not in sync with, you know, your goals or your personality, and so you recognize that it's a problem, versus something that's ego syntonic, you don't really realize it's a problem. So say ego dystonic, you're depressed and you know that you don't want to be depressed, and so that's ego dystonic because you want to be happy, and you know that there's something wrong. Versus maybe someone with borderline personality disorder, sometimes they have insight, but oftentimes people with any personality disorder don't necessarily realize that there's a problem. They're kind of in sync with their ego, or they think they are. And so I think of in sync, band, and, you know, saying bye 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 to feeling guilty about what's going on. That would be something that's ego syntonic. Operant conditioning, I have a grid that I also use for that, but just really looking at the root words. So knowing that anytime you're talking about something positive, you're going to be adding something. Negative is you're taking something away, and then reinforcement always increases a behavior and punishment always decreases a behavior. So negative reinforcement, you're taking something away in order to increase a behavior. So a great example there is a seatbelt, right? That annoying dinging sound that comes on. If you don't have your seatbelt on, as soon as you put it on, the dinging goes away. That rewards you for doing that behavior, which makes you more likely to do it in the future. And then negative punishment, you're taking something away to decrease the behavior, so maybe taking away a kid's toys, that kind of thing. Just a couple other quick examples. In my advanced micro classes that I teach, I use this case study of Laura, who has a variety of different issues she's facing, and then encouraging students to use that same case to practice several different modalities. So maybe that's psychoanalytic, maybe that's humanistic, family therapy, CBT, mindfulness, whatever that is, and applying it to the same example. And so you can really understand the differences of a theory using like the same case and applying like how would I do it if I was operating under behavioral therapy versus cognitive therapy, etc. A couple other mnemonic things, or looking at root words that I use, like parasympathetic versus the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic system slows you down and calms you down. So I think of a parachute, right? If someone is rocketing towards the earth and their parachute deploys, that's going to slow them down. And similarly, the parasympathetic nervous system slows you down, whereas sympathetic excites you. Opiates versus opioids, looking at, so in terms of substance use, opiates are something that's more naturally occurring, whereas opioids are more synthetic. And so I think of an Android phone, which, you know, farmers don't just grow androids in the fields, they create it out of, you know, synthetic materials. And so that's how I remember the difference between opioids and opiates. And then another example is to remember the difference between Medicaid and Medicare. I think of the root endings of the words. So Medicaid ends in ID, so you think Medicaid, ID, income down, because Medicaid is income-based. You have to have low income thresholds generally to qualify for Medicaid. I'm simplifying things here, but that's a memory tactic. And then Medicare generally is for individuals who are 65 and older. So I wouldn't necessarily use this terminology in real life, but just for the sake of remembering it, you remember Medicare ends in RE, so think Medicare, really elderly. Also using creative mediums. I sometimes use songs or jingles. So when I was trying to remember that Cerazone was an antidepressant medication, I thought of that AutoZone song that goes, "Get in the zone, AutoZone." And I think like, "Get in the zone, happy zone, Cerazone." And like think of that as an advertisement for that medication. And then I gave an example here. In many of my classes, I encourage students to make study guides of the material using creative ways. And so I drew this example. As you can see, I'm a fabulous artist, not. But I created this as an example of memorizing one of Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. So stage 6 is when someone, is a young adult, ages 19 to 40, and the idea is this crisis between intimacy versus isolation. So I drew someone on a dating app with their phone or whatever device this is. It's big enough to be an iPad. I meant it to be a phone, but I have this person, looking and swiping through pictures, and she's thinking about, love and marriage. And I have this, handsome dude that she's interested in, and his name is Eric. And he's got a 25 on his jersey because that's like one of the ages. And so it helps me remember, okay, intimacy versus isolation is the stage, you're kind of in this young adult, and it was Erikson's stages. So that's an example of using some, creativity to remember things as well. In terms of licensing exams, I talk a lot with students about strategies for that. So you can take prep classes at UTA. You can buy books from the ASWB, which is the official kind of source. You can use an app called Pocket Prep that has free questions of the day. I would encourage you to save your textbooks and PowerPoints from your classes to refer back to. Teaching others is an extremely effective way of remembering material, and so if you can explain something that you've just learned to your child or your spouse or a friend, that can really be helpful. Quizzing yourself through recall is one of the most important ways of memorizing new material. So flashcards or taking tests, things like that can be helpful. And learning rules, not examples. So what I mean by that is, what is the rule behind the answer to a certain question, and not trying to specifically remember every individual case. So an example of that would be previously in this presentation I talked about the engage, assess, plan, the EAP in every terminal, that thing. So if you had a question on the licensing exam that's like, this person's dealing with this, and that problem, what should you do first? And the correct answer is, validate her feelings. That doesn't mean that every time you see what happens first, you pick the validation answer. What you want to know is what's the rule? What's the order? So if you then get a question that says you've already validated her and you've already, set goals and assessed her, what do you do next? Or then the answer is probably going to be an intervention rather than, continuing to do engagement and rapport building. It's really important to have frequent short study sessions instead of cramming. So I can't stress enough that if you're studying for a big test, you really want to start early and do, even if it's just 20 minutes a day for a week, that is much, much better than spending a couple hours the night before trying to cram it all in. Having good nutrition, and particularly research shows having good amounts of iron, B12, fatty acids, and protein is important. Having adequate sleep and exercise, particularly aerobic exercise, is really good for your body and your brain. Having relaxation and mindfulness techniques, using the process of elimination, qualifying words. So again, thinking about, did we say, what would happen next, or what's the best answer? Be cautious if it ever says never or always. It's pretty rare that something is really truly a never or always situation, so that might be false. Asking a lot of questions of your professors and continuing to engage in education and lifelong learning. and seeking and accepting feedback. When I was a child, I was really sensitive, and if someone, like if I got even slightly in trouble, I would just be beside myself and crying, and I'd feel so bad. And it was really hard for me in school. If I got anything less than, an A or 100% on something, I would really beat myself up and feel kind of bad about myself, and I just really would feel down if anyone said anything bad about me. And as I matured and grew older, I really grew in that area, and now to the point where I'm much, much more open and receptive to receiving constructive criticism, because I saw that as a growth opportunity rather than that fixed mindset, right? I talk about that in my intro PowerPoint, the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. And so I encourage students to think of it as like a gas tank. And if you're driving and you notice that your car is close to empty and you need to really stop and take some time to fill it back up, that doesn't mean that your car is bad or defective or stupid. It just means that it's in need of some extra resources and support. And similarly, if you don't get the grade you were hoping for on an assignment, or you get less than a stellar review on your performance evaluation at work, just encouraging you to use that as a learning opportunity and accepting and seeking, because it's ultimately all about learning. And the more open and receptive and accepting you are to that kind of feedback, the better you're going to be at learning and progressing both personally and professionally. And finally, I'm ending with some recommended resources. I'm kind of a bookworm, and I love books related to learning and studying. And so I've included some, I guess, references to some different books related to this topic that I highly recommend. I'm also including here links to short versions of kind of summaries of those books. So of course, I recommend reading the book. That's the best thing. But I recognize that we all have busy lives, and you might want to get a little bit of knowledge without having to go out to the library or Amazon and order a book. So there's some different YouTube videos that I've included here that are either TED Talks about that, or news clips, or summary videos of the key concepts for some of these, my favorite learning books. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and good luck.